Hi, this is Dr. Chuck Betters, and you are listening to a Help and Hope resource provided by Mark Inc. Ministries. You know, over 350 million people worldwide will experience some form of depression. And I believe those who have never experienced it often think that the depressed person just needs to try harder. Bill tells, the author of Lay It Down, Living in the Freedom of the Gospel, and he shares his story of severe depression and how trying harder only took him deeper into the pit of despair. Friends, depression is one of those crises of life that is experienced in isolation. But today, you will hear the story of help and hope that will not only encourage the depressed person, but will help those who love him or her to better understand the battle. So, Bill, welcome. It's great to have you with us today here on Mark Inc. Ministries.
Thank you. Privileged to be with you.
Bill, you know, before we actually get into talking about the severe depression that you experienced, why don't you tell us about your life right now? Where are you right now?
Well, physically, I'm in Colorado Springs. and,
Beautiful part of the country.
My wife and I have worked with the Navigators. We're now in our 46th year. Unbelievable that I can be that old. And my current role is staff and leader development specialist. And I particularly focus on 20 to 30-year-old staff that lead our campus ministries. The focus with them is how do you lead a movement that is passionately committed to the gospel? My wife, Sue, and I have been married for 46 years. We've got 2 married sons. We've got 5 grandchildren. But we don't have an empty nest because we still have Lexi, our golden retriever.
Your list of accomplishments is really impressive, and especially the leadership roles you had with that great organization, the Navigators. What are some of your responsibilities when you were the vice president? What did you have on your plate then?
Yeah, lots of things. I served in vice president role for about 14 years. And as you can imagine, there'd be a variety of responses over that period. I oversaw our U.S. collegiate ministry. For a time, I oversaw our U.S. military ministry. I served as deputy director to our U.S. president. And then the last 3 years as vice president, I served as chief of staff. I always like to refer to it as chief of stuff. But I have to add, the entire time that I served as vice president, both my wife and I, we never lost our heart for college students. And that is why I initiated resigning from my leadership role and went back to the field ministry. You know, every missionary movement in spiritual awakening in history has been launched and initiated by young people. And so we wanted to get back out there to the fringe of the ministry and be a part of that.
Yeah, I could understand that. Well, as you were serving in this role, that's when the depression hit. Is that correct? And how old were you when that happened?
I would have been about 49.
Had depression ever been a part of your life prior to that?
You know, I had never experienced depression before that. But like all of us, I would have periods of being discouraged or of being moody. But in contrast, and in contrast to my leadership traits, I have a strong melancholic streak in me. So, some days I might feel rather schizophrenic, but no, I had never experienced depression. Just kind of normal discouragement and a few moody days here and there.
Well, why don't you describe the moment when your body and mind just seemed to shut down?
Well, Chuck, that morning is absolutely etched in my memory. And I describe it vividly in my book. So for our listeners, if they want more detail, let me encourage them to go to the first couple chapters there. But Sue and I were traveling, and we were participating in a missions conference at one of we consider our home and supporting churches. And we were going to see lots of friends, and I had eagerly packed and overloaded our schedule. And I woke up early Sunday morning. The missions conference was going to start that morning. I woke up early Sunday morning, and it was still dark. And I began to experience something that I had never experienced before. I woke up dripping with sweat. My heart was pounding. The room was spinning. I mean, I literally felt like I was going to fall out of bed because I found myself grasping the sheets just to hang on, and it was absolutely terrifying. And now, now as I look back, it was the first of what became many panic attacks. As a result of that morning, my schedule for the day totally was eliminated because as I looked forward to the day, my refrain was, I can't do that. I can't do that. I can't do that. So basically we canceled everything on my schedule for the day.
Were there any warning signs that took place before that particular day? Anything happened prior to that that kind of gave you an indication, hey, something's not right here?
In retrospect, yes. But at the time, we didn't connect the dots. I had come off a period of time where I had extremely heavy responsibility. I was very, very, very tired. My tank was empty. My emotional tank was empty. My physical tank was empty. My spiritual tank was empty. And the first indicator or warning sign was I was having trouble sleeping. I'd wake up about 3 a.m, just absolutely filled with energy. And sleep is and I didn't understand it, Chuck, because sleep is my spiritual gift. And I've never had trouble with it. Another early indication of that was the things that I always wanted to do, the things that I love to do, I didn't want to do them anymore. And as I thought about the commitments on my calendar, and, I didn't want to do them, but they were things I'd always loved doing in the collegiate ministry and being with our collegiate staff and being with students. And now I'd think about going to this campus or that meeting, and I just go, I don't want to do that. So those were some of the early signs that really didn't make sense to us.
Typically people who are battling depression have a lot of difficulty doing some of the things that are the mundane things, like reading or engaging with another person for more than a few minutes. Yet your particular calling required you to interact with lots of people. Did you continue to work or attend church or social functions? What happened after that depression struck you?
Chuck, I couldn't do any of those things. Once I got home, my days were pretty much spent sitting in my favorite lazy boy recliner, just trying to survive. I couldn't read anything. I couldn't read the Bible. I couldn't read the newspaper. And just to communicate how serious it was, I couldn't even read my favorite Louis L'Amour cowboy books. Now that's pretty serious, my friend.
Pretty serious.
I couldn't watch TV. I couldn't talk on the phone. I couldn't have visitors come. When visitors came and would ring the front doorbell, I would go to our bedroom and just hide in the corner. And every day was black. Every day was dark. And I'd never experienced anything like this, but every thought I had was negative. And I knew I was dying. And one day I knew I was dying of a heart attack. And the next day I knew I was going to have a stroke. And the next day I knew I had a brain tumor. But thankfully, during this time, the Navigators gave me sick leave. And one of the really special things during this time is the U.S. president called my wife, Sue, every day for a couple of months to see how I was doing. But other than that, I was just at home. I couldn't do anything.
It had to be so frustrating to feel the way you felt. You also had to come to a point of saying, hey, I need some help.
Yeah.
Where did you turn for help?
Well, one of the first places I turned was to my doctor. I actually called him that morning from our trip when I first experienced that first panic attack. I actually called back to Colorado and talked to him, and he told me to keep a journal of how I was feeling for the next few days. And then when I got back to the Springs here to bring in my journal and read it to him, and he assured me that I wasn't going to die. And that was very, very, very important because I needed to hear that. And so very early on, I got some medical help because I had no idea what was going on. And then I turned to a very good friend, Bill Thrall. Bill is part of the True Faith Ministry, anchored down there in Phoenix. And Bill deeply, deeply understands the grace of God. So at about probably the 5-month point or so, I was able to travel, and we went down to Phoenix for a day to spend some time with Bill. And then he connected us with a very, very godly counselor in Denver. And we began a 2-week counseling intensive with him. And that was life-changing, Chuck. It started us on a dramatic journey, and that was incredibly life-changing.
You tell your story in your book, Lay It Down, and we have information on our website at markinc.org for listeners to learn more about you and your outreach and also how to contact you. But one of the great benefits of a book like yours, I think, is that it really does take the reader into the heart and the mind of a person who is struggling with what we will call clinical depression, and to help those who love them to better understand the journey they're going through. Because, there's no obvious physical wounds from depression. So it's kind of hard for people who have never experienced it to understand, a clinically depressed person cannot just buck up, pull himself up by his bootstraps, get back to life. Describe some of the emotions and the darkness that you experienced. Maybe somebody out there can relate to what you're saying.
Well, as I mentioned, every day was just dark. It was black. And I could feel the depression as I would sit in the chair or on the sofa. I could feel the depression just wash over me in waves. And I was unable to have one positive thought. A lot of the panic attacks would happen at night. So the thought of going to bed and going to sleep was terrifically scary. And when I think back on the time, Chuck, I think I was scared the entire time. I was scared of what was happening to me. And I was scared of what the future was going to be like. Would this ever end? Am I going to be permanently this way? And it was just a terrifying world and terrifying time to be in for me. Let me add that, the last thing I needed was advice or encouragement from some well-intentioned people, because they all had their silver bullets. I had one friend tell me that my problem was I wasn't eating enough whole grain bread. And I needed to eat more whole grain bread. And then, another person told me I was taking the wrong type of vitamins and so forth. When you're discouraged or depressed, let me use the word depressed, logic, another person's logic and their encouragement just don't work. And immediately once they give you their silver bullets and their logic and their encouragement, I would know immediately that person had never been where I was.
Yeah, they could not relate to you.
They couldn't.
Well, let me ask you a really personal question here. How did the depression affect your marriage? What were some of the inner turmoil? You're a provider, a protector, and did you struggle with the inability to fill that role? Or were you so ill that you were able to accept that you just could not do it? How did all of this affect your relationship to your wife?
Yeah. Well, it was an interesting time in our marriage. It wasn't a bad time, but we were just in a place we'd never been before. And everything we knew about our roles and about how to serve each other and to love each other, all of that was just wiped away. And it was a time of incredible mystery for us. Sue couldn't understand what I was going through because she'd never gone through it. And I was struggling with how do I explain to Sue a feeling to someone who's never had that feeling, and you can't. I couldn't find words to explain and communicate what I was going through, and it made me feel very, very, very alone. And of course, being alone is scary. It's terrifying. Sue knew that a pep talk wouldn't help me, and she knew encouragement wouldn't work. And actually, giving me a pep talk or an encouragement, I think would have made me feel even worse, because I would not have been able to buck up like she told me to. And I would felt more of a failure. And so what I really needed from Sue was just her presence, because it was scary to be alone. I just needed Sue's presence. I really didn't need her words or anything. I just needed her to be there.
And is that what she did?
Yes, yes. Now I knew I also had to protect her and allow her times away and out of the house and with her friends. But those were very scary times for me because I was home alone. And, if a panic attack would hit, it's really scary to be alone.
Bill, you talk a lot about being a people pleaser in your book. What do you mean by that? And how did being a people pleaser contribute to your depression?
Oh, excellent question. Because we all struggle with shame as a result of the fall back in Genesis 2, Genesis 3. Every person is going to be a people pleaser in some aspect. I don't believe anybody's exempt from it. But I want to be quick to add that the gospel is what rescues us from that. Shame tells me that I'm not good enough, I'm broken, I'm unlovable, I'm dirty, I'm defective, I'm flawed. And because shame wants to tell me that, we hide, we wear masks, we perform, I excel, all of those things in an effort to hide what we don't want other people to see and what we don't want them to know about us. Because if they saw those things about me and about you and knew those things, I'm scared to death that they would reject me. And of course, rejection and abandonment is absolutely terrifying. And so, my shame statement that I grew up with was, I don't have much worth and I'm stupid. And those were built in by the dynamics of my family and my parents and the environment I grew up in. And so I developed a strategy that to deal with that. And my strategy was this, is that I was going to meet every expectation I thought that you had of me. And not only meet them, I was going to exceed those expectations. And that is how I would have worth. But, I think the underlying principle in the scriptures is you can never work or perform your way out of your shame. You can't do it. If you try to work your way out of your shame or perform your way out of your shame, it actually increases your shame because at some point your performance is going to fail, your effort's going to fail, and you're going to wind up saying to yourself, I knew it. I knew that's who I was. And so the only solution to people pleasing, the only solution to our shame is in the gospel.
In your book, Lay It Down, Living in the Freedom of the Gospel, the summary of your book says this, and I'd like you to react to this.
Yeah.
It says, call it burnout, a spiritual breakdown, or a personal crisis. The toll of Bill Tell's decades of successful ministry finally caught up with him. Incapacitated and depressed, he found that the road to recovery began at the cross. To his delight, healing opened new freedoms as he embraced the gospel in new ways. What does that mean?
Well, let me begin, Chuck, by saying that I think all clinical depression will have a strong medical component to it. And I think it's unfair and it's hurtful to tell a person that's just a problem of their willpower or it's just a spiritual problem. I think it's like telling a person with a flu to get over it. Or somebody with a serious cancer, just come on, get over it. There is a medical aspect to it. But for me, I think believing some unhealthy lies about my identity, that I didn't have any worth, that I was stupid, and so forth, believing those lies led me to some very, very unhealthy, toxic ways of living. And I think those toxic ways of living helped to trigger, for me, what was an inbred predisposition to depression. There is some family history that I have in that direction with my sister and parents and grandparents and so forth. And so for me, discovering the good news of who I am in Christ, that I don't have to perform my way out of my shame and that I'm not worthless, I'm not broken, and discovering that I am enough in Christ. Those truths began to restore me to some healthy living and began to remove the triggers from my life that would initiate and trigger the medical response of depression. And so I wouldn't want people to think that depression is just a spiritual issue or a willpower issue or an emotional issue. There is more to it than that. But often it's triggered. It can be triggered by a spiritual issue, a past hurt, a lie that we believe. Not always, but that was true for me.
Bill, you have opportunities to share your story in many different kinds of forums and environments. What is the the most frequent response you get from audiences after you share your story? Maybe why is it important for people experiencing depression to actually hear someone like you admit, I struggle with depression?
Well, after I shared my story, and Sue and I made a decision, we were not going to hide it. We knew that wouldn't be helpful. But as I share my story, and of course, depending on the size of the audience, there's always at least one person who comes up after everybody else leaves. And they look both ways to make sure nobody's there to listen or overhear what they're going to say. And then in a whisper, they say, I have never told anyone this, but you just described me. Or they'll say, I've never told anybody this, but I'm on antidepressants too. And, I think it's so important for that person to hear my story, because they need to come out of hiding. Whatever we hide always stays unresolved. And not only does it stay unresolved, it's like a malignant tumor within us. And time just doesn't heal what we hide. And so they need to bring it out into the open where somebody can love them and put their arm around them and walk with them. There is no healing in hiddenness.
Mm. You mentioned earlier that you started counseling, and it was one of the best decisions you made. You landed a particularly good counselor who understood what you were going through. Are there other elements toward that road to recovery that you could suggest to people who might be battling clinical depression right now? In other words, what are some of the keys to surviving clinical depression?
I think first is don't try to hide it, because you can't. You may think you're hiding it, but all your friends will know that you're struggling. And so don't even try to hide it, because you can't. And then I think secondly, don't be ashamed to get medical help. In clinical depression, there's an imbalance of your chemicals in your brain, and that needs to be addressed. So don't be ashamed to go to the doctor and get help. There's nothing to be ashamed there. And then I'd add, get a counselor who understands the good news and the implications of the gospel, so that you can begin to eliminate any unhealthy strategies that you have for living that may be contributing to the depression. It could be mostly medical, but for a lot of us, I think there's unhealthy lifestyles that probably contribute, in stress contributes and things like that. And I think for most of my friends, there is a medical component that needs to be addressed. But for many of them, they just have toxic thoughts that contribute to a toxic way of living that creates such stress, the stress of hiding. And that just messes with the chemicals in our brain. And so I think don't hide it. Get some medical help, and then find a counselor that can help you deal with your toxic memories and thoughts that influence your behavior and way of living.
Let's take that one man or that one woman right now for our last question, who's sitting across the table from you right now, and they're in the pit of despair. They just can't put their finger on why, but they know that darkness you described earlier is part of what they have to live with every day. They're sitting across the desk from you right now.
Yeah.
What would you say to give them hope?
Chuck, I don't think there's anything I can say that will give them hope. That person's mind will not accept my encouragement. I think it's absolutely impossible. But there are some things I can offer. I can offer my faithful presence. I can offer my respect. I can offer my protection. I can be an advocate to help open doors and opportunities for them, and then walk with them through those doors and into those opportunities. And ultimately, our hope has to be in the gospel. We may never physically get better in this life, but the gospel still gives us hope of a future life in which I'll be whole. And so I'm not sure there's anything I can do to give them hope, but my love for them will work. Love works.
What advice do you give to the people who are the caregivers of the one who's battling clinical depression? The spouse, the children, the neighbors, the friends. What advice would you give them when it comes to how best to minister to the person who is battling depression?
Don't try to fix the person. You can't do it. And there's so many ways we try to fix each other, We do it by encouragement, by giving a verse, giving them a book, something like that. And I found I just couldn't respond to any of that. And I needed Sue to just be there, to know I was protected. So I just need people to kind of stand at my perimeter for a long period of time until I was ready to let a godly man come close to me and ask some questions. And it was interesting, Chuck, in the 2 weeks of intensive counseling, this counselor probably made, and we met with him every day for like 3 hours. In those 2 weeks, I think he made perhaps 6 statements altogether, but the rest of the time, he asked questions. Gifted question asker that led me in a path of self-discovery. And I discovered things about myself that I did not know. And in that self-discovery, I found an incredible amount of healing. I know when I tell people my story, I'm telling them my story. I'm not asking for help. And I think we have to differentiate when somebody just needs to tell us their story, what they're struggling with. We need to differentiate that between them telling our story and them asking us for help.
Well, I am Dr. Chuck Betters, and you have been listening to my conversation with Bill Tell, who is the author of a tremendous book. I would encourage you to get it, called Lay It Down, Living in the Freedom of the Gospel. Now, people worldwide struggle with clinical depression, and I am very confident that Bill's story of his own battle with this darkness will encourage many there who have no hope. Now, you can find more stories like Bill's when you visit markinc.org, but there you will also find an interview with Bill's wife, Sue, where my wife Sharon interviews her, and she describes her journey as Bill's caregiver. Now, if you're struggling, you do not know where to turn for help, please contact us here at Mark Inc. Ministries through our website, markinc, markinc.org. And our team wants to help you find peace and purpose that comes from a personal relationship with Jesus. We want you to trust him. We want you to believe the gospel and receive Christ as the provision for your sin and my sin. Trust in him and him alone for your salvation. I want to thank you for listening to this resource from Mark Inc. Ministries. Bill, I want to thank you so much for being so transparent, your willingness to open your heart to help those who are in need of help and hope.